If you've not met before, my name's Dave. I'm one of the leaders here at Grace Church. It's great to have you here with us this morning. And I'm going to be speaking this morning. I'm going to be speaking in a few moments' time. I'm going to turn to the 15th chapter of a book called Luke in the New Testament. If you've got your own Bible or you want to follow along in that, but all the words will be on the screen behind me as well. But in some ways, what I want to do this morning is answer the question about Father's Day that we've kind of alluded to a few times already this morning, is that why is this harder than we want it to be? Because it is harder than we want it to be for almost everybody, actually. And to try and explain why I think Father's Day is a little bit harder than I think we all expect it to be or we all want it to be, let me tell you something that at first will appear to have absolutely nothing to do with that. I've got a relatively addictive personality, and I have to kind of compensate for that and be aware of that some of the time. And one of the things that I do because of that is I will tend to detox from various things in my life a couple of times a year to kind of mitigate against my own addictiveness. And so one of the things I will detox from, probably kind of twice a year, I'll do a caffeine detox. And I'll completely strip out mostly coffee, but also other sources of caffeine from my diet for like a week or two, a couple of times a year. And when I do that, there are some consequences of detoxing that are predictable that hit you. So like the feeling of just being much more tired for those, particularly those first couple of days of not having any coffee than you are normally used to being. But then there are also consequences of it that are predictable but do make you go a little bit like, wow. So like having a headache that lasts for like 2 or 3 days kind of opens your eyes a little bit. But then, if you are as an addictive as personality and as deep a user as I have been, then you will also face consequences that you didn't see coming and really make you go, wow. Like sleeping worse for the first couple of nights when you're detoxing from caffeine if you're drinking as much as I did. All of those things, all of those consequences, what are they doing in those moments? They're revealing to me, well, they should be revealing to me anyway, that I was more dependent and more addicted to caffeine than even I thought I was beforehand. There was one time where I'd gone on a caffeine detox and we'd gone shopping that day, and then we realised that we had very quickly made it the most expensive day of our lives going shopping that day, and I still felt like trash at the end of it, and I was like, why do I feel? Oh, I've tried to plug shopping into the caffeine-induced hole in my life, and neither have been very good at fixing the problem. What on earth does that have to do with God and with Father's Day? Well, hear me out. It's helpful sometimes to think about God in an upside-down kind of way. What we're used to doing is we're used to seeing the God of Christianity, whether you've read the Bible for yourself or you've just heard a few stories from the Bible, presented to us in a way where the God of Christianity has some human language over him, or what's called God presenting himself to us anthropomorphically. And those are descriptions of what God, where God is making himself understandable to you and to I. So God is telling us something about himself that we're not supposed to take literally, but shows us what he's like. So there's descriptions in the Bible of God having a mighty arm, of God having the nations under his feet, or the smell of people's sacrifices reaching God's nose. Those aren't things you're supposed to take literally to say that kind of people are actually underneath God's feet. No, they're pictures of what God is like. So God's mighty arm is a symbol of how strong the God of Christianity is. Or God having the nations under his feet is a symbol of how God is the God of all people. Or the smell of people's sacrifices, God's awareness of what people are doing for him, that he's not ambivalent towards those things. But if you only think like that, you only get actually half of the story. Because God can present himself in human language to us because humanity has been made in God's image and God has created the world. And so that means that human beings and the world in which we live are a bit like God, or the kind of opposite way round of saying that technically would be that the world and you and I are theopomorphic, but that's a made-up word. But the thing is, if you get into studying theology, you'll find out that made-up words are, in fact, absolutely fine. People just do that all the time. So there's one very famous theologian called John Frame who says, the reason that man can anthropomorphize God is because God has theopomorphized man. And if you like words like that, you'll go, that's really clever. And if you don't know what those words mean, you'll go, those words are just made up. And you're right. They are. Here's what I'm saying, is that the reason that we can think about God in human terms is because God has made us and made the world in godly terms. And the things in this world are made in light of who God really is. And so that means that when the God of Christianity is described as a father, it is not just God seeing, there's a good metaphor that I can use that some people who happen to have had good fathers on earth will appreciate and value when they're trying to understand me. He is using that to say that he has made human beings in his own image, designed, hardwired to the very core to know and be in relationship with an eternal heavenly Father. And that is why Father's Day is harder than we feel like it should be. Because we are, all of us, longing for that. And no matter how good your experience of earthly fatherhood has been, we will feel the withdrawal symptoms of it not being the real thing, like a caffeine addict who's had it taken away. And when we feel that withdrawal symptoms, whatever those might be like, they should help us to realize that we are more hardwired to know a God who is an eternal Father than we might have thought we were. But that should leave anybody asking themselves the question, well, what kind of Father is the God of Christianity like? And in the 15th chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus tells a story of what God is like as a father that is perhaps the most famous story that Jesus has ever told. It begins like this. Luke describes how Jesus was talking, and now the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Luke, who's recording this, wants you to know from the get-go that there are certain kinds of people who in that time were described as tax collectors and sinners, which is a shorthand for some of the lowest people in society who were being drawn towards what Jesus was like. But then there were also people who were from much higher echelons of society, much more religious parts of society, and they were recoiling from what Jesus had to say. And so Jesus recognizes that and says, so he told them this parable. A parable means a story with a meaning, and it says that Jesus told them one parable. This is one story with a meaning that comes in 3 acts. The first act goes like this. What man of you, Jesus says, having 100 sheep, if he's lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that he has lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so, I tell you, there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Then Act 2. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house until she diligently, until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Part A and Part B, Act 1 and Act 2 of this story, they tell the story of, firstly, something that is lost far away from its own home, the lost sheep, and then something that is lost even while it is still within the home of the person who owns it. We should have those ringing in our ears as we then read Act 3, Part C of the story, where Jesus says this: "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of him said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.' and he divided his property between them. Now, it's often really helpful in understanding the Bible to understand some of the contextual and cultural things that are going on at the time. And we're going to do that a little bit this morning, quite a bit actually. But some of the time you really don't need any context to know what is going on. So can I give you some really bad Father's Day advice? Whip out your phone at some point in the next 15 minutes when you're tired of listening to me and text your dad and say, actually, happy Father's Day. Could I just have my inheritance now? You don't need to know cultural things about the first century or the Near East. I've just seen somebody, I'm not going to look at them, lean over to their father. And I suspect I know what they just said. You don't need to know cultural things about the first century Near East to know that what this younger son has done is offensive, and beyond offensive, really. But what do we find the father responds to with is that he did it, and he divided his property between them. That would have been incredibly damaging. This wasn't an area where it was easy to liquidate assets and just kind of give a lump of cash to his children. In order to have divided his property between his children, he would have needed to sell things. This is presented as a wealthy land-owning kind of father, but that land would have been decimated by this action. He would have had to sell this field and sell that property and sell these cattle in order to give his son the money that he is asking for. This is enormously damaging. But it's not just damaging materially, it would have been damaging socially as well. So we pick up the story, verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey to a far-off country where he squandered the property with reckless living. It doesn't say that that's what his original plan was. But it does say that he's driven to doing that. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had. Why? Because of both the physical and social consequences of what he's done. The shame that he would have brought upon his family and here it is helpful to know a bit of context, a shame and honor first century culture that was closely knit, where people knew what was going on, would have been enormously damaging. Everybody would have been talking about the horrendous actions of this child, and this child up sticks and says, well, I'll take my cash and I'll go. The thing is that that's not the end of what's happened. In the kind of first century Near East close-knit community like that, if somebody did this kind of thing that would have brought shame upon themselves, shame upon their household, and damaged the household that they were from, and by extension in a close-knit community, not just damaged their own household, but damaged the whole community, and then they left, then they ran away, the men of that community would take a clay jar, and they would fill that jar with bitter herbs, and they would perform something called the kezeza ceremony, which means cutting off. They would take the jar to that road by which the young man had left the town, and they would smash the jar on the road as a mark of the bitterness and shame that they had brought upon them and their community, and as a cutting off of saying that person who's left is no longer part of it. But the kid didn't just leave, did he? Did you see what Jesus said? He went off and squandered what he had in reckless living. Verse 14. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. This is a state of desperation. And again, at this point in the story, you really don't need to know much culturally to understand the state of desperation he's in, do you? Imagine being so hungry that you walked past a pig eating and you were jealous of the pig. You do not need to know lots about the first century to understand how desperate he is. But when he came to himself, when he had a moment of self-awareness, when he had one of those like caffeine addict revelation moments of realizing the state he was in, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise, go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' treat me as one of your hired servants." And he arose and came to his father. Imagine that walk home. Imagine every step of the way thinking about how well presented and how wealthy you were when you left town, and now the state in which you're in as you're going to return. Every step along the way, revising the speech that you've written. "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." Wondering how it will be received. "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." That, in saying treat me as one of your hired servants, he's making quite a particular request, though. There were two kinds of servants, like wealthy kind of landowning household, like the one that the father's described as having. There were those who were like residential servants within the house, who lived as part of the household and served in various ways. But then there were also these hired servants. They were people who didn't live within the household, they lived locally nearby, and they were hired in because they had a particular skill or a trade, craftsman or good with animals, etc., etc. And they were brought in to serve in that community, and they were paid to do so. And so when this son is rehearsing his speech to give to his father when he gets home, he's going, "Father, I've sinned against..." He's making two statements of truth and then a request. "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. I know," he's saying, "I know I do not deserve to be a member of the family anymore. I know that it's not only that, but I don't even deserve to be a member of the household, like one of the servants in the household. I know I don't deserve that. But if you apprentice me out to one of your hired servants, then maybe there's a chance that over time I could earn something back. I could pay off some of the debt that I owe you." Imagine that walk home, rehearsing that over and over again. "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." Imagine what's going through his head and his heart every step of the way. But it's actually worse than what we might imagine. Because that Kezazah ceremony, that cutting off ceremony, had a second half to it that was very rarely actually done. But that if the shamed individual who had left and had the jar of bitter herbs smashed behind them, if they ever had the audacity and the gall to return to the community that they had left and they'd caused so much damage to, the men of the community who had smashed that jar would stand either side of the road that they were returning along, and as they walked home, they would throw stones at them. There are two recorded incidences of the second half of the Kezazah ceremony happening. On both occasions, the person walking home died. For all of the words that he's practicing, for all of the speech that he's rehearsed, for all of the plan that he has, this son is walking home to his death. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to the father, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." Why doesn't he finish the speech? I'll tell you why. It's because he's already been told that he doesn't have to. When you read there that his father has run out to him and embraced him and kissed him, the language that this was originally written in was Greek, and the phrase that's translated there as "kissed him" is "fell on his neck." And that's saying something quite specific. The way that you kiss somebody signals something about the relationship that you have with them. And in the first century Near East, the way that a slave would kiss their master is that they would kiss them on the feet. The way that a student would kiss a teacher would be that they would kiss them on the ring or on the hand. The only people who would kiss one another on the face or neck would be people who were part of the same family, who had equal standing. And so when the father embraces his son and falls on his neck, he is saying, "You are back in the family," before the son has even had a chance to utter a single word of his speech. Why doesn't he say, "Treat me as one of your hired servants"? It's because he already knows he doesn't have to. He's got no request left to make, So he can only say the two statements of truth. I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Because whatever plans the son had, the father is telling him, look, there are two things I am utterly unprepared to do. The first thing I'm utterly unprepared to do is I am unprepared to see you face the consequences of your own actions. You are not going through the second half of this ceremony. I am running out to you. The second thing I am completely unprepared to see you do is to see you try and earn your way back in here. You are part of the family. You are back in. What kind of father is the God of Christianity? He's that kind of father. He treats us like that. That is the message of how God's grace comes to you. It's that you're already in, that you don't need to work your way in. But he's not even finished. He's got more extravagance to lay on. Verse 22, the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. This is extravagant. This is joyful. And do you notice where the joy comes from? It comes from the father. Remember back to the first few verses of this passage, and it said how there is rejoicing over one sinner who repents at the end of the story about the sheep and the coin. And sometimes that gets kind of regurgitated in Christian circles, and people say, if somebody becomes a Christian, then the angels in heaven are having a party. Good. It sounds a little bit like they're saying the angels are having a party, and God is sitting there kind of stoically going, yeah, it's kind of par for the course, really. Oh, yeah. But that's not what it said. It said there is joy before the angels of heaven when one sinner repents. Who is in front of the angels in heaven? The place that is celebrating most and hardest, the person who's starting the party, is not the people around the Father, it's the Father himself. Go, we are throwing a big do here. I am delighted that my child has come home. This is extravagant. This is the kind of father that the God of Christianity is. Now his older brother was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard the music and the dancing, and he called on the servants and asked them what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back, safe and sound. But he was angry, and he refused to go in. And his father came out and entreated him. This would have been a big party. You cannot kill a fattened calf and not have a long guest list. Otherwise, you're just going to have a lot of smell kind of accumulating in a few days' time. But like at a modern big party, in a close-knit community like that one, a big party that everybody knew about would have had kind of a ranking to it. There would have been tables for certain groups of people and like place names and that kind of thing. The older brother is the kind of person who everybody knew the presence would have been expected and would have been high profile. If he is absent from this party, everybody knows he is absent from this party. But he stays absent. He refuses to go in. And what's expected to happen? Well, what's expected to happen is a kind of a minor version of the Kezeza ceremony again. Everybody expects that the older landowning father, who's a senior member of the community, will go outside and give the older brother a good hiding for whatever reason. But that's not what the father does. He goes outside and he entreated him. That means he pleaded with him. He invited him to come into the party. Verse 29, but the older brother answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. Jesus is telling this story, and he wants you to know that there is a way of relating to God that's not really relating to God at all. There's a way of being lost even when you're in the same house. Do you notice how similar these brothers are? They are both lost. They both want control. One of them wants to achieve control through taking his stuff and running. The other one wants to receive control through obedience. They're both actually alienated from the Father. They don't have a relationship with the Father that they ought to have. They're both more interested in the Father's stuff than they are the Father himself. Both of them, the Father has to go out to. And both of them, the Father invites into a feast, into a celebration. And they are both loved more than they even realize. That is the kind of Father that the God of Christianity is. That is the kind of Father that the God of Christianity, that Jesus wants you to know, that you can know personally. And he wants you to know him all the way down to your heart. Not just in a few actions or social symbols or a few kind of nods in this direction or that direction. He wants you to know that the Father, who is the God of Christianity, loves you all the way to dying in your place, and he wants that to hit you to the very core of who you are. Imagine what would have been said about that older brother for all of those days, months, weeks, years, we don't know, where the younger brother was away. Other members of the community going, it's such a shame about what happened with that younger son, isn't it? Oh, but at least he's got the older brother. At least there's that good, at least he's the good kid who's around. And then that shroud of dignity comes crashing down at the party that he refuses to come into. And everyone's going, where's the older brother all of a sudden? And then the reason for the shroud coming crashing down is made even clearer when he says, look, you never gave me anything. There is a way of relating to God that's not really relating to him at all. And if you live like that, you might look like the good one for a long time, but eventually it all comes crashing down because the way you see the world and other people gets all sorts of twisted. When this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf. Earlier on in the story, as the younger brother was rehearsing that speech on the way home, he says, I've sinned against heaven and before you, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He says two things that are objectively true, and then his plea, which he never has to say. In this sentence, the older brother says multiple things that are objectively false, and he doesn't even realize it. First thing he says is this son of yours. He can't even call his own brother his brother. He says, this son of yours, who has devoured your property with prostitutes. How does he know that? It's like that kind of weird Freudian slip of, oh, what's been on your mind, older brother? What would you have been doing with the cash if you had run off? How do you know what he's been spending the money on? And you killed a fat. You've never done anything for me. We all, both of these brothers, and therefore by extension everybody, need a God-induced moment of realization. Like a caffeine addict, waking up realizing how much they have made themselves dependent on this thing. We need a coming to ourselves moment of realizing that we have been made for an eternal heavenly Father, and that we will never be satisfied, we will never be happy, we will never be content, we will never feel forgiveness, we will never feel joy to the depths and to the extents that we have been made to know them if we do not know and live in relationship with that Father. That Father who said to the older brother, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. That is the kind of Father that the God of Christianity is. And he offers to be with him. And he invites the older brother into the party, just as emphatically as he invited the younger brother into the party. He's treated these children incredibly similarly. He has looked out from his house over the property that surrounds it that has been irrevocably damaged by the actions of his younger son. And when he has seen on the horizon the silhouette of his son returning, he has looked over his own damaged property and run out and embraced him. And then he has looked out over his own party that he is throwing for his younger son and seen how that party has been irrevocably damaged by the absence of the older brother who everybody knows isn't there and should be. And instead of getting angry, He has walked out through his own party that has been ruined and goes and entreats and pleads with the older son to come into the party. And that is the message of that Jesus wants you to know about what the God of Christianity is like. What kind of father is he? He is the kind of father who would look out across his own son, whose body was irrevocably damaged by the actions of all of us who have sinned against heaven and before you and are no longer worthy to be called your son because of the million ways in which we haven't lived the life that we ought to have lived. He looks out across that son who bore that cost, and he entreats you. He pleads with you and he embraces you. He falls on your neck and offers to throw you a party for coming into his family. That is the kind of father that the God of Christianity is. But there's one final character I want to talk about before we go to worship again, who's in this story, or who's actually not in this story. In the Old Testament, in a book called Leviticus, in chapter 25, there's this one little verse that says, if your brother becomes poor and sells his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has lost. And appreciate that's probably not a verse that anybody here has got written on a mug at home or kind of on a nice little sign at home. But in the world where Jesus is telling this story and people knew those laws of the Old Testament incredibly well, people would have known that to be the case. That if your brother found themselves into trouble and became poor and had to sell their property, then what there was a responsibility, their nearest redeemer should come and pay their debts and welcome them home. That there should be, in this story, an older brother who rescues the younger brother. But that older brother's not in the story because that older brother is telling the story. That there is one who has always been willing to follow the will of the Father, but never out of kind of dutiful obedience to try and take stuff away from him, has always lived in a perfect relationship with the Father and has loved him and obeyed him, who has always enjoyed the Father's love and who was prepared to give it all up gladly to go to a far-off country to bear an incredible cost in order to bring back other children into God's family. That Jesus is telling the story as the person who is missing from the story. That's the kind of family that God has, that the God of Christianity has. That's the kind of family that the God of Christianity offers you to come into. That holds a feast, that holds a party for anybody who would come into it as well. Did you notice that the conclusion of this story is left hanging? That whilst we know what the younger brother does, we actually don't know what happens to the older brother. It's left hanging because I think Jesus, who's told the story first, and Luke, who's recorded it, wants to invite anybody who's hearing it to be part of finishing the story. Do you want to come to the feast? Do you want to enjoy this celebration? Do you want to know that you can, with all honesty and openness, you don't need to put a gloss about it, you can say, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the moment you think you need to say, treat me as one of your hired servants, I'll clean my act up, I'll be better, I can do this right, I'm sure I can be a better person, God has already said to you, no need. I'll deal with the cost, I'll deal with the pain, I'll deal with the brokenness. It's time for you to be part of the family now. Come and join in the celebration. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to worship together and we're going to celebrate. We're going to sing out loud about how the love of God has come to us and how transformative it is. Can I invite you to stand? There is an incredible amount of honesty in this story, isn't there? An incredible amount of healthy self-reflection when that younger brother says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He's saying that the mess I found myself in is in part my own mess. In fact, in majority, my own mess. Maybe this should be freeing enough a moment for us to do the same. For us to go, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. That I have made a mess. That maybe even some of the reasons why we find today, Father's Day, harder than we ought to is because not just of the mess that other people have made, but also because of the mess that I have made. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your child. Thank you that at that moment I can shut up and I can enjoy the fact that you have welcomed me in at incredible cost. You have welcomed me into your family. You've put a robe on my back, a ring on my finger. You have called me a child, and that now we can enjoy the party. Amen.